Hello, and welcome to the first Family Investment Center Ask Us Anything webinar. I am Tamara Stelting, your host for today's webinar. Founded in 1998, Family Investment Center is a team of professional advisors that provide clients with commission-free fiduciary services in investment management and financial planning. We have offices in St. Joe, Missouri, and Lenexa, Kansas. We currently serve clients all over the United States. I would like to first introduce Dan Danford, founder and CEO of Family Investment Center. Dan holds a bachelor's degree in marketing from Missouri Western State University, a master's of business administration from Northwest Missouri State University, and Master's of Science in Personal Financial Planning from Kansas State University. As our in-house writing guru, Dan has been published extensively on investment-related topics, and his articles or comments have appeared in both professional and consumer magazines like the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, U.S. News and World Report, Barron's, and the New York Times. He has also written several books, including his newest book, Happy to be Different, Personal and Money Success Through Better Thinking, which is now available on Amazon. Dan has served on the Midwest Region Board of Directors for the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, NAPFA. He currently chairs the NAPFA Public Policy Committee, which monitors and directs national legislative and regulatory issues. Dan has taught personal finance in university and has been a presenter at local, regional, and national workshops and conferences. Joining Dan today is Richard Salmen, president of Family Investment Center. Richard joined Family Investment Center in January 2018. He is a certified financial planner, certified trust and financial advisor, chartered financial analyst, and an enrolled agent with the IRS. Prior to joining Family Investment Center, Richard served as the CEO of Northern Financial Advisors and principal of G Trust, overseeing the firm's financial planning practices. Richard graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor's of Science in Business Management from the University of Nebraska at Kearney and a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Kansas. Richard served as the 2009 Financial Planning Association National President and the 2018 Chair of the Board of Certified Financial Planners, Board of Standards. In 2016, he was recognized as a recipient of the Heart of Financial Planning. He also is a retired air traffic controller and former Army Reserve captain. Dan and Richard are fielding questions from our Slido polling app. If you'd like to submit a question, open your phone and scan the QR code. You can also go to slido.com and enter the code hashtag FIC Ask. Once on the Slido app, you can ask a question. Please make sure you stay anonymous. If you see a question already listed that you like, you can click on the thumbs up button and that question will receive more votes and rise to the top of the list. The questions with the most votes appear on the top of my screen and will be asked next. Thank you, Dan and Richard, for letting us ask you anything. Let's get started with our first question. All right, our first question: what changes will you make in our investments based on who wins the presidential election?
Wow, great question. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm pretty cynical, and I distrust anybody's predictions about the future. I kind of compare it when I look at things like this. It's like the old Foursquare game board that we did on the playground, where on one side you have basically four squares. On one side you have Biden and Trump, And at the top, you have good for the economy and bad for the economy. Now, the interesting thing about that is you'll find qualified expert opinions in all four squares. I mean, it's very difficult to know, number one, who's going to be elected, and number two, whether the election results will be good for the economy or bad for the economy. So kind of my response to that is, we'll have to kind of wait and see and then decide what makes sense probably after the election's done. Does that make sense, Richard?
Absolutely, Dan. And one of the I believe we've got a slide that we can bring up and show you guys. There's two different slides that I was looking at when I saw this question come across. And one is the performance of the stock market and the investments under Republican administrations, and another is under Democrat administrations. So Tamara, I don't know if you can bring that up or not, but if you can show that to our audience, that would be great. And basically what you see is it doesn't matter whether it's Republican or whether it's Democrat, you see a sliding increase in value up to the right with a lot of choppiness in the middle is basically what you're looking at. And I can tell you that one of the things that I find interesting is I can remember when Bill Clinton got elected, because that was some of my first years back in the business back in the early 90s. And all of my conservative clients thought the world had just ended. And we survived 8 years of Bill Clinton. And then we had George W. Bush get elected, H.W. Bush, and we had 8 years of that. And all my liberal clients thought the world was ending. And then we had Barack Obama, and then we had, Mr. Trump. And so the bottom line is what the stock market's really about and what investing is really about is the growth in the value of the U.S. economy, and by extension, when we invest internationally, the world economy. And we also have a slide that shows how did the investment markets do when you had a Republican Congress, you had a Democratic Congress, or you had a divided Congress. And in both of those situations, ultimately, what we ended up with was an increase in value of the investments, which is a reflection of the increased underlying value of the U.S. economy. So we don't jump in, we don't jump out, and we're not in the prediction business. We've got a balanced approach that we take with our clients, and we will make adjustments when adjustments are justified, but we don't do it based on the outcome of presidential elections.
Yeah, one thing's certain, and that's that corporations, common stocks, they find a way to adjust and make money as you go forward. So no matter what the outcome is, they will start adjustments immediately to figure out the best way for them to be productive and to grow in value over time. So it doesn't matter so much who's president, I think.
Okay, our next question is, how is the stock market performing so well with so many people being unemployed?
Dan, if it's okay with you, I'll take a shot at this one.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So it's interesting what's been happening. This was probably the most complete governmental response that we've seen to a crisis in a long time. In terms of, we had both fiscal response and we had monetary response. The fiscal response from Congress was the CARES Act, the $1,200 checks mailed out to everybody, as well as the paycheck protection loans for small businesses. A lot of dollars were thrown at this problem by Congress and by extension, the president, when he voted it in law. But then also we had monetary policy. The Federal Reserve jumped in, cut interest rates almost immediately to zero, and even more importantly, started a bond buying program that really provided liquidity to the bond markets and the fixed income markets in a way that really was even in excess of what we saw back in 2008 and 2009 during the Great Recession. And so investment markets reacted to that. We had a flood of money coming into the economy. Some of that money gets spent, but where does some of it go? It goes into investment markets. All of you listening today have probably seen what's been going on with the housing market. As people have been working from home, spending more time at home, guess what have they been doing? They've been putting money into houses, and the housing market has really been hot. And we have clients all over the country, and there really isn't an area of the country that doesn't affect from a housing market standpoint in a positive way. So what the stock market values are predicting is that we're going to survive this, and that we're going to come out the other side, and that there's plenty of liquidity in the economy to make that happen.
Yeah, and I'd say, all of us are sympathetic to the people who are without jobs. I mean, it's a terrible crisis for a lot of people. But I'd also say many of those are in like the smaller companies. We all know the story on restaurants and hotels and things like that, where people aren't working, and glad to help them any way we can. But those smaller companies aren't well represented in the stock market anyway. So the larger companies have actually performed pretty well during this period of time, partly because of the governmental actions out there. But what we're seeing is that the companies have mostly remained profitable, even though there are little segments of the population that have really, really suffered under this. So I don't want to negate the issues. There are real issues out there, and there are people who are really suffering, but that's different from what's happened in the investment markets.
Great answers, guys. The federal deficit is now so huge that a financial future collapse seems inevitable. What measures does Family Investment Center have in place to protect assets when this occurs?
Oh, Richard, I want to take a run at this. I tell people I started in 1984 in the investment business, and there has not been a single day since then that the sky was not falling. Okay, you go check every issue of the Wall Street Journal for the last 30 plus years, and you'll always find people predicting doom and gloom. And I understand it. It's almost the same with the federal debt. I can't remember a time when people weren't claiming that the federal debt was too high and that the world was coming to an end. But one of the things I'd say about this, and what I point out to people when they bring that up, is that although the number is a huge number, so is the gross national product. The size of our economy has exploded at the same time that the debt has exploded. And so that number just sounds incomprehensible. And oh my God, everything must be coming down. In truth, it's still a relatively small part of the gross national product. And most of the economists who watch it say, well, it's an area of concern, but it isn't an imminent collapse. So I guess I write this off kind of as being like all the predictions I've seen over the years. There's a certain group of people who fixate on the bad stuff, and that's what they talk about. And there's no question that we probably have too much debt. But for being catastrophic, I don't think that's where we are.
And I would agree with what Dan just said. And as a follow-on to that, there's actually a new sort of economic theory called modern monetary policy, modern monetary theory, MMT. There's a professor, Stephanie Kelton, who was actually at the University of Missouri, Kansas City here for years before she moved back east. And I think she's at Stony Brook University now. But one of the things that she talks about, and I think there's some validity to this because we have some experience with Japan, who has been running deficits much, much, much larger than ours for many, many, many years, and is still here. And you talk about sort of a muddle through economy for Japan, but the reality is when a country controls its own currency, and I don't want to get too technical on this, but the U.S. government owns the U.S. mint. That means that any debt that is denominated in dollars, and it's the same currency that they can print, right? So ultimately, you can end up with a situation where the debt becomes a big problem, but where that's going to happen is it's going to be inflation. There will not be a situation where the government can't pay its bills. There will not be a situation where Social Security checks can't be sent out because all they have to do is print more money. And I know that's a hard concept to get your head wrapped around, but ultimately what would devalue the currency is not the ability to create more of it. It's the fact that inflation, people will stop being willing to accept it as a currency. And the example we've seen from Japan is we still have a very, very long way to go before that happens. It was a big change when Nixon took us off the gold standards in the early 1970s. And in some ways, we're still trying to apply a gold standard philosophy to a fiat currency like we have now. And we've still got a lot of learning left to do.
And interestingly, we've seen few signs of inflation. That's the thing, is a lot of people said with all this new printing of money and all that kind of thing, that there would be inflationary pressures and that had to be watched out for. And it is something that the Federal Reserve is watching closely, but no sign of inflation yet. So, some of those worst fears, again, have not happened. And doesn't mean that there won't be some sign later, but if it does, we're expecting the Federal Reserve to respond at that time. But for right now, it hasn't presented a problem at all. And I think most of those fears are probably pretty overblown.
Okay, another question. Some convert regular IRAs to Roth IRAs approaching retirement or after retirement. Can you discuss this strategy?
Sure. So just as a quick explanation, a regular IRA, when you take money out of that IRA in retirement, you have to pay taxes on it. You can take it out and spend it. Another thing that you can do, if you choose to, is you can take that money out of your IRA and convert it to a Roth IRA. The difference with a Roth IRA is that it will never be taxed. Once the money's in the Roth IRA, when it comes out on the backside, it doesn't matter. It's been 30 years and it's 5 times bigger. You're never going to pay any income taxes on it. But the key is, as you think about doing this in retirement, is what tax bracket are you in at the time that you're getting ready to do this conversion? Because what you're doing, if you take money out of that regular IRA to convert to a Roth IRA, and let's say you're in a 35% federal bracket and a 6% state bracket, that means 41 cents of every dollar is going to a government agency, and only 59 cents of every dollar is going to end up in that Roth IRA to grow. Doesn't mean we can't come out ahead eventually, but that's a lot of headwind. Where we like to use this strategy is if clients are in a very, very low tax bracket for a number of years, say early in retirement, if they retire before they start collecting Social Security, that sort of thing. And then you can convert some money over into the Roth and then let it grow. I always tell clients that Roth IRA money is the last money we'll ever spend. And it's the best asset to pass on to your kids if we have any. But for many, many clients, it just simply doesn't make sense, because sort of the way we look at it, if you're in a combined tax bracket of 30% or more, so something like 25% federal, 5 or 6% state, it usually doesn't make sense to take that big of a haircut out of your income, out of your principal, before you move it over into the Roth IRA.
Yeah, and we see, and the other thing is, and I think it's really important on this discussion, there's like so much in money, there's a psychological component too. So let's say you decide, even if you decide that it's a good thing to take your $500,000 IRA and convert it to a Roth IRA, like Richard just pointed out, that means you're going to pay taxes of 40%, $200,000. Here's where people stumble. When they get ready to write that check to Uncle Sam for $200,000, I mean, that is tough to do. That is right now. You're going to write a check for $200,000. It's just too much for too many people to stomach. And even if it's a good idea, you have to overcome that in order to accomplish the Roth IRA. So we've even seen some cases where it's borderline or possibly slightly good for them to do the Roth, and they just can't bring themselves to write that big check, and I don't blame them.
Following up on a retirement question, this one says, I am in my 50s and I'm wondering if long-term care insurance is really worth it.
Yeah, it really is. It's an important question, and I talked with a client about it yesterday. Couple of factors. One of the things I bring up is that marketplace has changed dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years. So if you looked into this 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, you probably need to relook into it today, because many of the people who were providing those policies have left the business. The assumptions that they made when they wrote the policies 10 or 12 or 15 years ago turned out to be wrong, and that the insurance companies lost a lot of money on these policies, and they just don't want to write them anymore. So one of the things that's happening is the policies are changing, and they may be better value 3 years from now than they are today. And that's the trade-off with a long-term care policy. If you're too young when you buy it, you will pay premiums too long before you collect. So if you buy it when you're 45, but you don't become disabled until you're 70, that's 25 years of fairly high premiums before you draw on it. That's really tough and it doesn't make economic sense. On the other hand, if you wait too long, if you're 60 before you look into it, the premiums are just going to be sky high. So what I tell a lot of people on this is there is a window there, probably 55 to maybe early 60s, where the policies represent better value than other times. But it's also true that those policies are changing pretty dramatically. And so, it may pay to wait a year or 2 years before you make a decision. Now, does that make sense to you too, Richard?
Yeah, it does. There's some factors to really think about. I mean, the people that made out like bandits on these, and there are some people, and it's part of the reason the rates are going up so much, is when these first started to be sold in the 90s, they've only been around for 25 years or so. And they were lifetime benefits, and the premiums couldn't change on them at that time. You could get a policy that you paid up and you were done. And so you've got some people that ended up spending, 15, 20 years in a nursing home and it was completely paid for. Well, that wasn't the assumptions that the insurance companies were putting into this. And so what I tend to try to help people understand is that for a lot of our middle class type clients, is that we view long-term care insurance as sort of a niche product, because basically what are you insuring? You're insuring with long-term care insurance that you're not going to run out of money. Because we do have a program in this country called Medicaid, that if you run out of money, there is going to be a bed for you in a nursing home that Medicaid is going to cover. They're going to take, your Social Security and whatever other income sources that you have, but ultimately you're not going to be out on the street at that point. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, the amount of premium that I'm paying for this policy justified in terms of what it's going to take away from my retirement? Because what you're really insuring is the ability to pass on an inheritance to somebody. For most middle-class people, that's what you're buying with long-term care insurance. Now, potentially you could have a nicer room. You could have a private room with long-term care insurance versus a semi-private room when you're under Medicaid and those types of things. But, when it comes right down to it, when we get to that stage of life, I'm not sure how much we care about that kind of stuff, because we have some clients where the premium increases were getting so high. I mean, we've seen premium increases of 60, 70% in a year, because when you buy that policy, it's not locked in. It can go up and can continue to go up when the insurance company goes to the state insurance commissioner and says, listen, we're going broke. And if we don't get these premiums, we're not going to continue to be able to honor these policies. So the other thing to take into consideration, though, is, and this is important, is there are many times when we will recommend long-term care insurance more for a woman than we will for a man. Because if you visit a nursing home, the ratio of women to men is about 9 or 10 to 1. For men, most of the things that we have afflictions with, we go to the hospital and get better and go home, or they bury us. Where women live long enough that things like mobility issues and other things become more of a factor, even, cognitive issues like dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that. Not that men don't get those things, but we just don't typically live as long. So each situation's different. And if that's something you're thinking about, the next time you meet with us, we encourage you to talk with us about it.
All right, we have another election question. If Biden is elected and taxes increase, what strategies would Family Investment Center employ to reduce the risk of lower taxable income to its clients?
Well, so another one of my kind of hard and fast rules is I don't worry about things until they actually happen. I get clients who call all the time and they say, well, I read an article and thus and so is going to blah, 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 blah. And the truth of the matter is there's a long process between somebody proposing something and something actually becoming law. So the way I understand it, as best I can understand it right now, many of the kind of Biden proposals for raising taxes basically would take them back to what they were during George Bush Jr.'s administration. Okay, so those are not draconian taxes. Okay, they were taxes that we've had in the last 10 or 15 years. So I'm not sure that it changes the prospects that much in terms of what you do. On the other hand, there's a possibility if they would repeal some of the estate tax things that were done, that would probably affect many of our clients, because if you lower the amount that you get a credit for when you pass, and estate taxes would kick in, that's an important piece. So I probably let Richard talk a little bit more about the income tax implications. But even if we did go back, I'm not sure it's at the level that people are frightened about.
Well, thank you, Dan. And one of the things that, Tamara, if you can bring up a slide that we've got that has two big Latin root words. One says exogenous, and the other one is endogenous. If you can bring up that slide, this is a slide that we use in our investment presentation, and it covers a lot of issues. But the thing I want to point out with this is there are things that are outside of our control. That's what exogenous means. Things like tax rates, things like oil prices, things like inflation and pandemics and COVID, and you name it. There's a large list of things. Election outcomes fall into that category, other than our own individual vote. But then there's a whole nother category of things called endogenous variables or internal variables. Things like our health, the status of our relationships. What are we doing to manage our careers? What are our spending habits? These are the things that we do have control over. And, and again, this covers a lot of issues, and I'll talk a little more about the taxes too at the end. But this is a point I really want to make, is that it's so easy at a time like this, in a year like this. I mean, who in the world would have thought on January 1st of 2020, when we're ringing in the new year, that this is where we would be at in late October, right? It's sort of like being in a 15-round prize fight where you just keep coming out of the corner every round, and then you get another punch, and you're not, you're leading with your face. And so in this type of a situation where you've got COVID and you've got, the possibility of a contested election that people are worried about, the possibility of an administration change and higher tax rates, and all these kind of things, I advise people pull back in and think about the things that you can actually control. The things that we're going to look at if we have income tax rate changes is, what are the things that we can do to shelter income? What are the tools that we have at our disposal? Are we maximizing the benefits of things like 401k plans and things like the HSA accounts that we can put tax-free money into for health needs, things like that? Those are the things that you're going to focus on. One of the other things that potentially comes into play in that kind of a situation is tax-free bonds. They, in a higher tax environment, tax-free bonds can make more sense. But again, you also have to then look at it through an investment lens, because you have to make sure that those tax-free municipal and state bonds and things like that you're buying aren't at risk either, because there's a lot of municipalities and a lot of states that are in some pretty serious financial distress right now. So it's a multifaceted decision. I agree with Dan. We can't plan for it until we get there, but we will help you through it. That's the bottom line.
And I think one of the municipal bond issue is something that I talk about with clients all the time. And people hate paying taxes so much that sometimes they'll own bonds when it isn't in their best interest. And I see this especially with people who bought tax-free bonds, when they were in their peak earning years. And then after they've retired and their income has dropped, considerably, they continue holding those tax-free bonds. But the tax-free bonds, after you save the taxes, don't yield more than what they get in treasury securities or other kinds of bonds that are just as safe. In other words, in order to avoid paying taxes, they're giving up income. Now, not true in every case, but people who feel that way often make mistakes because they think they're doing the right thing. And it's like everything else we've talked about so far. There are just so many different factors that you can't just say, hey, this is the right answer. The right way to say that is, hey, this is the right answer for you, or this is the right answer for them. But almost nothing applies universally across the board. And that's why it's so important to get expertise and professional help, especially when the numbers get large.
I'll finish that up, Tamara, with a saying that we like to use around here, and that's don't let the tax tail wag the dog.
Absolutely.
Because so many times decisions are made. I'll call out my farmer clients on this, because I've had farmer clients that would buy a combine they didn't need just to save the tax dollars because they didn't want to pay Uncle Sam. And it makes sense in certain circumstances, but it's got to fit your whole picture. I think we probably beat that one enough.
But now we get to move on to college. This question is, how should we prepare for college expenses in the next 5, 10, and 15 years, given the pandemic disruption and apparent shift in virtual learning and consolidations?
Wow, that's a big question. And that covers a lot of areas. I truly believe that we are going to see a significant change in the higher education landscape in this country. Their bottom line is a lot of colleges won't survive if we have a situation where it's all virtual learning. Their economic model just won't work. They need students on campus for it to be successful, and a lot of them need international students and out-of-state students. But I will tell you one thing that's really fascinating, and this is basically breaking news. This happened in the last few weeks. And I may be wrong about this, but I think it was the state of Missouri that fired the first shot on this, where they basically said, hey, starting next year for incoming freshmen, if you're from one of the surrounding states, you no longer have to pay out-of-state tuition. You get in-state tuition. Well, guess what happened? Kansas immediately jumped on the same thing. The state of Nebraska, I read, has just done the same thing. So it sort of becomes a race to zero in that kind of an environment. But that can potentially be an option now that's more economical. If you're living in Kansas and wanting to go to school in Missouri or vice versa, you're now going to have the option, it looks like, to pay in-state tuition, even if you're not from that state. But to reiterate my other point, I really do think we're looking at an environment where the traditional 4-year baccalaureate degree is probably going to shift in some ways. I think you're going to see more on-the-job training programs, more kids coming out of high school going straight to work and getting some kind of trade school or tech school education or some kind of partnership with the company they're working for, getting more education targeted towards the job that they're doing. It's going to be a significant change because the student loan debt load really is significant. If you're not coming in, and this is one of the things that we talk about with clients all the time. And I don't know if my son's listening to this webinar or not, but I was so proud of him when we started talking about him going to school. And the first words out of his mouth were, well, Dad, I really think it makes sense to probably go to an in-state school. I can't see paying the higher out-of-state tuition, or private school tuition based on, what I'm wanting to do in life. I think he heard me, because I've been saying that kind of stuff for clients for a long time. If you're going to go to Stanford or you're going to go to the East Coast to one of the Ivy League schools, the reason to spend that kind of money is A, because you can get in, but B, because you're going to be able to take advantage of the network that you're going to develop out in Silicon Valley, for instance, with Stanford, or on the East Coast in the Northeast in New York City or Boston. You need to do that. If you're going to go to an Ivy League school and come back to work in Kansas City, I would argue it's awfully hard to do a cost benefit analysis on that works. And parents have to be very, very careful. And this is one of the things I would advise you to talk with us about, is the balance between your own future retirement funding and the education funding for your kids. And it's a difficult task.
Yeah, and that marketplace, really interestingly, any of us that have been involved in colleges or universities, I was on the board of governors for one. There's been a shakeout coming for a long time, because the demographics no longer support the number of colleges and universities that we have, and that's before the COVID crisis. So they were already fighting amongst themselves to get students, because there just weren't enough students. There just aren't enough people in that age group. And so Richard's exactly right. The COVID has changed that marketplace forever. But part of the reason why it's changed is because it was already changing. It was already in trouble. And I concur completely. One of the things, my wife was a school counselor, and one of the things that really bothered her and came to bother me was people who wanted their kids to go to a prestige school for their own ego gratification, but then wanted to saddle the kids with all the debt. And it was like Chris always said, somebody come in and talk to her. She said, you've had 18 years to prepare for this. And I think one of the most reasonable things you can do is sit down with your college age child or a few years before college age and talk to them realistically about finances. This is how much this family can afford to spend. And it's okay if you go to another place, but you're going to have to cover those expenses in some fashion. I just think those realistic talks for a lot of people, it's tough for them to have them, but they're so important, because the downside is if you don't have that talk 25 or 20, a few years later, when the child is 25, 26, 27, and they're saddled with $100,000 in debt, it's going to be really tough to figure out how to get out of that hole. And so it just takes some planning in advance, and that's why it's so important.
And just to piggyback on what Dan just said, that made me think of something else. One of the other conversations we have with with clients all the time, with students getting ready to go to college, is what's really the right educational path for your student. I think we've done a disservice in many ways in measuring our high schools by using a measure of how many of those graduates end up going to four-year institutions. That's basically how you become highly ranked as a college or as a high school. So what do? They end up pushing students to go to four-year colleges because it benefits them in terms of their ranking among their peers. But there's an awful lot of kids that aren't really cut out for a four-year baccalaureate program and would be much better served. I went through a program back in 2012 called Leadership Kansas, and it was just absolutely amazing, some of the businesses that we visited, how they were struggling to get qualified help. I know Spirit Aerospace down in Wichita literally set up a partnership with a community college down there to develop a 2-year program so that they could bring in skilled machinists into Spirit Aerospace. They were building, the fuselages for the Boeing 737s and the wings and things like that. And they couldn't get enough qualified people. There's a lot of those trades that really produce a good income and a good livelihood. And if that's really where your passion's at and where your energy's at, don't spend a year and $20,000-$30,000 going to a four-year college to realize you made a mistake, to come back home and then go another direction. It's like Dan said, you need to have that conversation when they're 15, 16, 17 years old, realistically, not just about the finances, but also really, is that what they want to do? And are they ready for that jump? There's other times where it makes perfect sense to spend a year or two at community college, living at home, because you're just not quite ready to leave the nest yet. So that's a partnership between the parents and the kids that is very, very important.
Our next question has to do with the election again. Does Family Investment Center ever employ moving investments to cash right before an election to absorb a sharp risk of loss?
I can't remember ever having done that. And if somebody came to me and asked, I'd say it wasn't a good idea. And the main reason is because you really don't know what's going to happen. Even if you, in your heart of hearts, are absolutely certain that it's going to go this way, number one, that doesn't make you right. And number two, you don't know what the response is going to be if you're right. I mean, even if you are right, that this, I made the right call on the election, you don't know how the economy is going to respond to that. And the downside of doing that is what makes it so dangerous, is that you're out of the market when the market jumps up 20%. So if you look at the stock markets, I didn't bring a chart to tell, but I'll just talk about it for a second. Over time, what happens is the stock market moves in fits and starts. It may sit at some level area for 3 years or 5 years or 6 years until everybody's getting disappointed and angry that, hey, I haven't made any money there. But then it may take a 30% jump that makes up for that 5 or 6 years of not much happening. Same thing happens when you go to cash. If it happens that you're at cash when the market takes that big jump up, then you've lost something that you won't be able to replace. The second problem is, and I'll let Richard talk about this a little bit, but that's, so you made that call, how do you know when to get back in? I mean, it's not a one a one decision process. It's a two decision process. It's when do I get out and when do I get back in? And I'm just completely unconvinced that anybody has the ability to make those kinds of calls, including myself.
Dan, I agree. I agree with you. You know, there are times when the investment markets, whether it's the bond market, the stock market, may seem by historical measures relatively overvalued, relatively undervalued. But you know what? We don't have a crystal ball that looks into that future clearly. It's pretty darn murky. And we don't think it's the right move, just like Dan said, to go all in or all out of anything. We might shade a little bit one way or the other. And that goes for whether we're owning, you know, value stocks versus growth stocks, owning international stocks versus US stocks. You know, we shift those percentages a little bit. You know, that's part of what our job is, managing money for you, is to read those tea leaves and look into that future as best we can. But by no means do we think we're smart enough to say, let's go to cash now and let's put it all back in on red 30 days later, 60 days later, 90 days later. A huge part of our value to you is taking the emotion out of the investment process. You know, that's really where I believe we add the value, is that, you know, we fielded a lot of phone calls from clients the first part of this year when COVID was coming in, talking about the challenges and everything else. And if we'd let our clients all go to cash at the end of March, when would we have bought them back in? Would it went back up the first 10%, 20%, 30%? We just don't think that's the right way to manage money, and it's not the philosophy we follow here. You know, and again, it's your money. If you tell us, put me in cash, then we're going to put you in cash. We're just going to tell you that we don't think it's the right decision, and I'm going to have you sign a piece of paper that we said don't do that. So that's how we manage the investment management process, and it's worked very successfully for a lot of years for our clients.
And I'd also say it's a huge red flag. The more certain somebody is when they tell you what's going to happen next, the faster you ought to run to get away. If you're talking to investment professionals, advisors, I don't care whether CPAs, lawyers, whoever, if they don't tell you that they don't know, then they're not being honest with you or not being honest with themselves. The best people out there understand that there is no crystal ball. And even when I feel strongly that something is going to happen, there's a fairly high percentage I'll be wrong. Nothing humbles you like the investment markets. And I just can't express that enough. If somebody says this is what you need to do because this is going to happen, that should be a huge red flag for you.
Our next question has to do with the housing market. Regarding the housing market, is there a chance that we're blowing up another housing balloon that is going to pop and have multi-year investment implications?
Well, I don't think this is at all like 2007, 2008, 2009 from that perspective, because that speculative bubble was built on a base of what I call liar loans, where essentially in 2005 and 2006, if you were breathing, you could get a loan. You didn't really have to be able to document your income. That's why I call them liar loans. It was sort of built on a house of cards. And then you had a situation where you had companies, and I'm not going to name any company names, but they were basically building derivative investments out of these loans and selling off the tranches of those, which is, we could spend an hour talking about all that and why it was bad and what the problems were. But ultimately, that led to a speculative bubble in housing that I think is different than what it is today. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that house values are rising right now. They're rising faster than inflation. But some of that is driven by the fact that people can't put their money where they traditionally did. They're not spending it on travel. They're not spending it on vacations and other things. And so, you know, I know around the Kansas City area, when you look at Lake of the Ozarks, Table Rock Lakes, things like that, people are buying vacation homes. They're upgrading their homes that they're living in. And a big part of that is because of how much time they're spending in their homes. That's something that they can feel and touch, and they feel better about putting the money there than they do someplace else. So that doesn't mean by the way, though, that housing prices can't drop. They very well could. Nothing goes up in a straight line forever. That's one of the fallacies we have as humans, or one of the problems that we have, is we have a tendency to think whatever's happening now is going to continue to happen forever. And pretty much guaranteed that everything's cyclical economically. And so the sort of rapid rise that we're seeing in house prices right now probably will not continue, into the future unabated. There will be a time when they come back down. I just don't think we're likely to see in the short term the same type of bubble bursting because of how that was built around the financing.
It's really interesting, and part of what is driving that market is like Richard says, people staying home and looking to their homes as a recreational place, so they want to upgrade and that kind of thing. But part of it is also systemic, because the Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates to the level they are, and you can afford more house on a level of income than you could when rates were higher. And so low interest rates is part of that. But interestingly, I was talking earlier about how businesses and people adjust to the circumstance. When my wife and I bought our first house way back when, interest rates were 11% for mortgages. And the funny thing is that we all adjusted to it. We bought houses with 11% mortgages. I mean, that's hard to perceive today when interest rates are down at 2 and 3%. But I think in some ways, a little bit too much is made of current circumstances in a lot of financial decisions. It's amazing how easily we can adjust when things change.
Okay, the next question has to do with gold and silver. What are your thoughts on buying gold and silver as part of your portfolio? If it is a good idea, what percentage do you recommend investing?
Oh, you should buy enough gold coins that they feel good in your pocket. There's an ad on TV now, drives me a little crazy. I can't even remember who it is, but he says, among all the things that are good about gold, I just like the way it feels. And I think that is the selling point of the entire ad, is I like the way it feels. And I like the way it feels too. I happen to think it's not a very good investment idea. And one of the reasons is because, they'll always cite, well, gold's gone up 40% or whatever. But there are decades when gold has not moved a nickel. Okay. They only advertise like that 2 times. 2 times is, number one is after gold has already made a big move, then they advertise it and say, 30% up or whatever. The other time is in periods of economic turmoil. So when things seem like they're going to hell in a handbasket, which may be now, you see people start advertising gold as an investment. And I get that. But I always come back to, okay, let's assume the worst catastrophe possible. Dollars aren't worth anything. People are roaming the streets and you need gas in your car. How is that gold going to help you? Are you going to go to the gas station and break off a piece of the coin and trade it to the guy for a tank of gas? No, you're not going to. As much as you may love gold, it really isn't as practical as you think it is. So I'm not an advocate. I'm okay. If it makes you feel better, take a chunk of money, say 3% or 4%, and go buy you some gold or buy gold futures or whatever. Put them in your portfolio if it helps you sleep better at night. But I don't anticipate that it's going to help your portfolio returns going forward.
Well, and the only thing I would add to that is I think this is also a bit of a hangover from back when the US dollar was supposedly on the gold standard. Right. And there's a historical, sort of precedence that people put on that, and a historical value that people put on it. And, gold is, gold, unlike silver, doesn't really have an industrial use, because silver actually has a lot of applications where it's used in manufacturing and production and things like that. Gold is simply considered valuable because somebody else is willing to buy it from you, and you can make jewelry out of it, and it shines pretty and that sort of thing. So we don't get too excited about gold. And I could only echo what Dan just said. You're not going to take your gold coin and go trade it for a loaf of bread so you can eat. I don't think most people that are thinking of using gold in a doomsday scenario have really thought that through very much. Because what's the first thing that's going to happen if you got a bunch of physical gold and we're in true anarchy? Somebody's going to try to take it away from you if they know you got it. And what's the first way they're going to know you have it? You go out and try to spend it to buy something. And so we at Family Investment Center do not subscribe to a doomsday prepper type of philosophy. We believe that our way of life and our system of government, it'll evolve and it'll change, but we don't think it's just going to collapse. And we don't manage money based on that philosophy.
All right. How does Family Investment Center differentiate itself among other fiduciary investment management firms?
Wow, there's a softball question. I like whoever sent that one in. Thank you. We are fiduciaries, and we're fiduciaries all the time. And what being a fiduciary means in law and what it means to us is that you have to put your client's best interest first all the time. You don't get to take that hat off. And secondarily, it means that in the area you're giving advice, you have the expertise to be delivering that advice. So it's an intent component and it's a competency component. That's what fiduciary means. And if you're a registered investment advisor in this country, either registered with the SEC as we are, or registered at the state level if you're smaller, you don't ever get to take that fiduciary hat off. You are always held to a best interest of the client first standard. The other standard in this country is what's called a suitability standard. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that's regulated under FINRA. And under a suitability standard, it's not as high. You're not required under a suitability standard to always put your client's interest first. And that's a brokerage model or a sale of investment products model. And that is in no way to say that that is wrong. We simply made a choice. Dan made a choice in 1998 to go fee only and to not accept any commissions. And I've been through a couple of different business models. Many of you were with us at G Trust during that time and Legacy Trust Company before that. But we made that same decision back in 1997 to go fee only. And it's not because the sale of product is wrong. We refer our clients out regularly to somebody to sell them a life insurance policy or to sell them long-term care insurance, as we discussed earlier, that type of thing. The people that sell that earn a commission and they're doing a good job for their clients and their customers. That's just not the role that we wanted to take. We always wanted to perceive that we were our clients to perceive and the reality to be that we're on the same side as the table as our clients and we do better when they do better. And so that's why we operate that way.
Yeah, and I'd say that the easiest way to understand it is one group of people in the investment business are sellers. They're licensed to help you decide on things and make decisions on things. The other group, like us, we're buyers. So when I sit down with my client and we build a portfolio and we say, this portfolio ought to be 30% stocks and 70% bonds or whatever, then part of my job is to go out and look at the marketplace with their eyes. I'm to go out and analyze the various options that are available to build that portfolio in their best interest. And by definition, if I get commissions on some of those things, I'm not doing it in their best interest anymore. I'm doing it in my best interest. So what we've done is just decided, hey, look, we buy investments, build portfolios, monitor investments on behalf of our clients. We sit in their seat and make decisions in their best interest. And it's just a better business model. And that's how come we've done so well over the years.
Well, guys, we are a few minutes before the top of the hour. I thank Dan and Richard for their insight and thoughts today and in the response to the many questions provided to us by our listeners. On behalf of Family Investment Center, the team here, we would like to thank also our many viewers who took the time out of their day to listen and provide their questions for our first ever Ask Us Anything webinar. I do know that there are more questions on our Slido app that did not get answered. We just ran out of time. The webinar was recorded and will be available on our website, or we can email you the link once we have it up. We want to thank you for joining us again. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and let's plan for some serious freedom.